What if the biggest conflict in Formula One right now has nothing to do with cars, but with a private agreement that was never meant to exist in the first place? Because after details of a confidential understanding between Mercedes and the FIA leaked, the reaction across the grid was immediate and explosive. Not curiosity. Not confusion. Anger. Behind closed doors, teams are now questioning whether key regulatory decisions were shaped long before they ever had a fair chance to react. And that suspicion has pushed tensions to a level the FIA was clearly not prepared for. And here's the part that changes everything. If this agreement influenced how rules were interpreted even indirectly, then this isn't just a political scandal. It's a moment that could permanently alter how power, trust, and governance work in Formula One. And once you realize that, it becomes very hard to look away from what happens next. Once the existence of this agreement began circulating privately, the atmosphere between teams changed almost overnight. This wasn't treated as another political rumor or paddock exaggeration. It was treated as a breach of an unspoken rule that underpins the entire sport, that no team should ever appear to have privileged regulatory alignment. Teams didn't immediately ask what the agreement contained. They asked why it existed at all. And that question has proven far more destabilizing than any technical controversy. What has unsettled rivals most is not the idea of dialogue between a team and the FIA. That happens constantly. What's different here is the suggestion of structure, of continuity, of something more formal than a clarification request or a technical discussion. If Mercedes had access to a framework of understanding that others didn't, even unintentionally, then competitive decisions were being made on unequal informational ground. And in Formula One, information asymmetry is often more decisive than raw performance. Inside rival factories, this has triggered a reassessment that goes far beyond Mercedes. Teams are questioning how many of their own past decisions were shaped by assumptions that may no longer hold. Assumptions about what interpretations were safe, about which development paths were discouraged, about where the FIA's invisible boundaries really lay. If those boundaries shifted quietly for one team, the implications stretch back years, not months. The FIA now finds itself under pressure from all sides, not because of what it officially approved, but because of how its neutrality is being perceived. Regulators rely on trust to function. They don't have the capacity to police every conceptual pathway in real time. That system only works if teams believe everyone is operating under the same informational conditions. This leak has damaged that belief, and repairing it won't be as simple as issuing a statement. What makes the tension even sharper is the timing. The sport is heading toward a major regulatory reset. Budgets are locked. Concepts are frozen. If teams believe that the playing field was tilted before those commitments were made, frustration turns into anger very quickly. Because there is no mechanism to rewind that kind of disadvantage. You can't respend years of development once they're gone. Mercedes, for its part, has remained careful and restrained. No denial of communication. No admission of wrongdoing. Just an insistence that all interactions followed established processes. That stance may be technically correct, but it doesn't address the deeper issue now driving the conflict. This is no longer about legality. It's about legitimacy. And this is why the tension hasn't peaked yet. Because the leak didn't just reveal an agreement. It exposed uncertainty about how power flows inside Formula One when rules are still being interpreted. How much influence is visible? How much is informal? And how much depends on who is asking the questions first? Until those doubts are resolved, every technical meeting, every clarification, every silence from the FIA will be viewed through a far more suspicious lens. And that shift in mindset may end up reshaping relationships across the grid long after the details of this agreement fade from view. As the fallout spreads, another, more uncomfortable dimension of this situation begins to surface. Teams aren't just questioning whether Mercedes benefited from this agreement. They're questioning how many similar understandings might exist elsewhere unseen, undocumented, and unchallenged. That suspicion is corrosive. It turns routine regulatory dialogue into a source of paranoia. Every private meeting, every delayed clarification, every carefully worded response from the FIA is now being scrutinized for hidden meaning. And once that mindset takes hold, cooperation collapses almost instantly. What's particularly damaging is how this leak reframes past decisions that once seemed benign. Regulatory calls that were accepted quietly are now being reinterpreted as potentially influenced. Not proven. Not confirmed. But possible. That uncertainty is enough to destabilize trust, because Formula One operates on the assumption that neutrality is absolute, not relative. If teams begin to believe neutrality depends on proximity or timing, the system stops feeling fair even when it technically is. Inside rival teams, frustration is turning into strategic defensiveness. Engineers and team principals are reportedly reassessing how openly they engage with the FIA going forward. Why disclose early concepts if silence carries less risk? Why ask questions if answers might vary depending on who's asking? This is the quiet behavioral shift regulators fear most. Because once teams stop engaging transparently, governance becomes reactive instead of collaborative. And reactive governance almost always arrives too late to prevent damage. The FIA's challenge now is far more complex than issuing clarifications. It must restore confidence without revealing internal processes that were never designed to withstand public scrutiny. Admitting too much risks confirming fears of preferential access. Saying too little reinforces the belief that something is being hidden. This is the kind of crisis that doesn't have a clean exit. Every response satisfies one side while inflaming another. And the longer it drags on, the more entrenched positions become. What's especially volatile is how this situation intersects with the cost cap era. When financial flexibility is limited, informational advantage becomes the most valuable currency in the sport. If teams believe that advantage was unevenly distributed, the legitimacy of the competition itself comes into question. That's not a technical issue. It's an existential one. Because once legitimacy is doubted, results stop being respected, even when they're earned. There's also a growing concern about precedent. If this agreement is ultimately accepted as normal regulatory interaction, teams will push harder for similar arrangements in the future. Not because they want favoritism, but because they can't afford not to. That escalation would fundamentally change how rules are shaped, turning governance into a negotiation between the most assertive participants rather than a neutral framework applied equally to all. And this is why the tension refuses to settle. The leak didn't just expose a document. It exposed uncertainty about where the real lines of authority and influence lie inside Formula One. Until that uncertainty is addressed convincingly, distrust will linger beneath every technical decision. And even if this specific controversy fades, the memory of it will shape behavior quietly, persistently, and profoundly. Because in Formula One, once teams start believing that power operates behind closed doors, the damage isn't measured in lap time. It's measured in how long it takes before everyone stops believing the rules belong to them equally. As this controversy continues to unfold, a deeper fracture is beginning to show itself beneath the surface of the paddock. This is no longer just a dispute about one agreement or one team. It's about whether Formula One still operates on a shared understanding of fairness, or whether influence has quietly become part of the competitive toolkit. Teams are no longer debating legality. They're debating legitimacy. And once legitimacy is questioned, every future decision becomes harder to accept, no matter how well justified it appears on paper. What's particularly destabilizing is how this leak has altered the way teams interpret silence from the FIA. In the past, silence often meant neutrality. Now, it's being read as ambiguity or worse, selective restraint. If the FIA chose not to intervene earlier, teams want to know whether that choice was procedural, political, or strategic. Because those distinctions matter. They determine whether trust can be rebuilt, or whether teams will assume that the absence of objection is effectively a green light for whoever is bold enough to push first. Inside technical departments, this has triggered an uncomfortable recalibration of values. Engineers are asking whether transparency is still worth the risk. Whether early dialogue with regulators actually protects a project or exposes it. That hesitation changes behavior immediately. Concepts are held back. Questions go unasked. And innovation shifts from open exploration to guarded execution. That is the opposite of what the FIA claims to want in a regulated, cost-capped environment. The political implications are just as severe. Team principals are reportedly re-evaluating alliances and voting blocks, anticipating future disputes where regulatory interpretation will again be decisive. This leak has reminded everyone that governance in Formula One is not abstract. It's shaped by relationships, timing, and leverage. And once teams believe those factors outweigh formal process, cooperation gives way to strategy. That shift doesn't create immediate chaos. It creates long-term fragmentation. For the FIA, the most dangerous outcome isn't losing this argument. It's losing authority in the next one. If teams feel that outcomes are influenced behind closed doors, they will stop treating the regulator as an impartial referee and start treating it as another political actor. That changes everything. Rules become negotiating positions. Clarifications become pressure points. And enforcement becomes reactive rather than principled. That kind of environment is extremely difficult to control once it takes hold. What makes this moment so volatile is that there may be no definitive proof either way. No document that clearly shows intent. No decision that can be cleanly reversed. Just a pattern of interactions that, when viewed together, creates discomfort. And discomfort is enough to destabilize trust even in the absence of guilt. Formula One has lived through similar moments before, and they rarely resolve quickly or quietly. This is why the tension remains unresolved, and likely will for some time. Because the real issue isn't what Mercedes and the FIA agreed to. It's how that agreement fits into a system that relies on shared belief as much as written rules. If that belief continues to erode, the consequences will reach far beyond this single controversy. They will shape how teams innovate, how they communicate, and how they compete for years to come. And long after the details of this leak fade from memory, the question it raised will still be there, quietly influencing every decision made behind closed doors. As this tension drags on, something even more damaging is beginning to emerge beneath the political noise. Teams are no longer reacting emotionally, they are adapting structurally. And that is when a controversy stops being temporary and starts reshaping the sport itself. Several teams now privately admit they are rethinking how they engage with the FIA at the earliest stages of development, not because they distrust the rules, but because they distrust the process surrounding them. That shift is subtle, but it's profound. When teams change behavior quietly, the consequences last far longer than any public dispute. What's becoming clear is that this leak has broken an illusion many relied on. The illusion that regulatory dialogue happens on a level playing field simply because the rulebook is public. In reality, interpretation lives in conversations, not clauses. And if those conversations appear to happen unevenly, even unintentionally, then the written rules lose their stabilizing power. Teams begin to believe that timing and proximity matter more than compliance. Once that belief takes hold, innovation stops being about creativity and starts being about access. Inside technical departments, the reaction has been defensive rather than aggressive. Design groups are reportedly limiting early disclosure, even internally, compartmentalizing ideas until they are mature enough to survive scrutiny. That slows innovation across the grid. Not because teams lack ideas, but because they fear exposing them prematurely in a system they no longer fully trust. Ironically, that means the very governance model designed to encourage openness may now be suppressing it. The political knock-on effects are equally significant. Team principals are recalculating influence ahead of future regulation cycles, recognizing that technical merit alone may not be enough to protect long-term investment. Relationships matter. Narratives matter. And moments like this determine who feels empowered to shape the conversation early. That dynamic doesn't show up in performance charts, but it defines who sets the agenda before the cars ever hit the track. For the FIA, the danger is no longer reputational damage in isolation. It's erosion of relevance. A regulator that is seen as reactive or opaque risks becoming something teams manage around rather than engage with. That's when authority weakens. Because authority in Formula One isn't enforced purely through penalties, it's maintained through confidence that the system will intervene when balance is threatened. Right now, that confidence is under strain. What makes this situation so volatile is that there may never be a moment of resolution everyone accepts. No ruling will feel early enough. No explanation will feel complete enough. The absence of a clear endpoint means this controversy will linger as institutional memory, influencing decisions quietly long after the headlines move on. Future disputes will reference this moment, even if indirectly. That's how trust erodes, not through one failure, but through unresolved precedent. And this is why the tension refuses to dissipate. Because the leak didn't just reveal a secret agreement. It revealed how fragile the balance between regulation, transparency, and trust really is in modern Formula One. If the sport can't convincingly answer where the line between dialogue and influence lies, then every future innovation will carry suspicion alongside ingenuity. And once suspicion becomes part of the competitive environment, the damage isn't measured in points or titles. It's measured in how long it takes before no one truly believes the system is neutral anymore.